In 1941, Disney Studios in California was in a rather bleak condition. They were deep in debt and were unable to produce profitable films. On December 7th, 1941, the United States joined World War II and was in desperate need of training films, propaganda, and insignia.
Despite Disney's doldrum, the studio dropped everything to provide solely for their country in this time of conflict, churning out hundreds of hours of groundbreaking war-themed films and artwork, compromising their studio, profit, and creative workflow.
The studio's tremendous sacrifice truly helped the country and the people within.
Back in 1923, Walt Disney and his brother Roy pooled their money and moved to Hollywood, along with their friend Ub Iwerks, and began the Disney Brothers Studio. It's here where they made their very first and iconic films, like Steamboat Willie, which was premiered in 1928.
The public loved Disney's films. Soon Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, and Pluto were working their way into every house in America. On December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length animated film, premiered in Los Angeles.
It was loved by multitudes. It produced an unimaginable $1.5 million in spite of the Depression and won a total of 8 Oscars. Plus, according to the Film Pictorial magazine,
there is a pathos and wizardry about it, combined with beauty. It moved me considerably and amused me with its quaintness. I was transported to a real make-believe world, so different from that provided by ordinary films.
Because of this massive triumph, in the December of 1939, Disney decided to open a state-of-the-art facility in Burbank, California. Disney was in its golden age of animation. Things were looking up for the company.
Despite all of this success, Disney was also suffering through some financial hardships. To escape this peril, Disney tried to create 2 new feature-length animations that would hopefully be as big as hits as Snow White. The films were Pinocchio and Fantasia. Sadly, the films were both duds, unable to turn a profit. To make Disney's financial predicament worse, World War II, taking place in Europe, interrupted Disney's foreign market.
On December 7th in 1941. Every one of us remember exactly where we were when this happened. They came on the radio and they said that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
The next day, the United States joined World War II and the military was in desperate need of training videos for its troops. Disney was in no condition to drop everything and provide solely for the war without a profit. But Walt Disney, being extremely patriotic, felt the need to assist his country during this difficult conflict.
The war film work would not present Walt with the usual artistic challenge that drove him artistically and professionally, but he approached it as a necessary job that might help save some lives. In a letter to Disney employees, Ralph Parker said they'd be making
films for the preservation of health and morale.
Walt's work for the war went beyond training films, as he produced propaganda, war-themed entertainment, informational films, and military insignia.
Disney also supported the armed forces through making insignias on request, free of charge. Hard-boiled personnel officers assure us our insignia have high morale value, said Bob Carr, staff writer for Disney.
The troops truly loved the insignia. Here's a letter from the 692nd Battalion requesting insignia.
We have seen such insignias from other organizations, and we feel that one of our own would be an asset to us.
The studio would go on to create numerous training films, entertainment shorts, and propaganda. These films would use a variety of budget-saving techniques, for the budget was very tight. The studio would often have to recycle old backgrounds or animation from old films, or the animation would just be choppy. For example, in The Seven Wise Dwarfs, a very large portion of the film is borrowed from Snow White. The studio, and Walt, hated doing this because they felt that the sometimes low-quality animation would tarnish the studio's good name, but they had to compromise to keep producing more material.
While being made fast, the films were also amazing. For example, The Spirit of 43, a 1943 propaganda/entertainment short that encouraged Americans to pay their taxes. This film was powerful. It convinced about 2/3 of its audience to pay their taxes on time. It was seen by 26 million Americans and was commissioned by the U.S. Secretary of Treasury.
Throughout the Second World War, the U.S. was going through many shortages.
There was just a whole number of things that were rationed. Gasoline was one of them. See, sugar was rationed. Rubber was just impossible to get.
The butcher would scold you if you didn't save your fat.
The Disney films touched on this too, putting Disney characters into relatable situations. Like in Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Firing Line, Minnie and Pluto were put into a situation similar
to save your waste kitchen fats
to one Americans face every day, conservation of supplies.
The dogs kind of got shortchanged.
Another notable film produced by Disney was *Der Führer's Face*, an anti-Nazi propaganda film that was made in 1943. It won an Oscar that same year. The studio also made amazing training films. The training films were especially useful because they used animation to explain tasks with visuals that would have been impossible to produce in a demonstration. An extremely effective example of one could be Stop That Tank. It was a film made for the Canadian government. It combined live action along with animated sections to demonstrate the use of the boy's anti-tank rifle. It combined humor with teaching to keep soldiers focused and help them learn. Many training films followed this format, plainly because it was so effective.
One of Disney's favorite projects that he did during the war was to produce a film called Victory Through Air Power. This propagandist pitch was, the only way to beat the Japanese is through air power. Sadly, its arguments fell through when viewed by the public. The artwork and cinematography was amazing, but it did not completely make up for the weaker parts of the film.
During the war, over 90% of the employees at Disney were devoted to the production of war materials. The facility put out over 400,000 feet of film during the war. That's 68 hours of uninterrupted film. To put it simply, Disney sacrificed a great deal of time and money to the war. Disney was a huge contributor in the war effort. The company boosted an incredible amount of morale and sacrificed a whole lot of time and money to help the country for no profit. Perhaps the reason that Disney was so successful during the war was because it was, well, Disney.
I mean, we took that as gospel.
Well, it made us more willing to cooperate with anything that they asked us to do.
Unfortunately, after the war, much of the film produced was rendered ineffective. This was true because of new technology. An example of this could be the WEFT series. WEFT was a series of videos on how to identify an Axis aircraft. However, some of the lessons learned through making a ridiculous amount of film in a short time and on a budget would stick with Disney and the Disney company for a long time. During the World War II strife, the studio needed to compromise their profit, the quality of their films, and their artistic style. But it wasn't all lost, for the studio did not only just learn to work under a budget, they also experimented with some new techniques, like putting animation over live action to create a stunning effect.
This technique made its debut in The Three Caballeros, a film that Disney made to build diplomatic relations during the war. But the films did not only affect the war, they also affected people on the home front for generations. This technique went on to be shown in incredible movies later on, like Mary Poppins. All of the films did not affect only Disney, they also affected the public.
The humorous entertainment shorts salvaged joy out of the audience's dire daily lives. Not only did they give the audiences a break from their daily routine, but they taught audiences too.
They were such slapstick movies.
Yeah.
Kind of B-type movies, you know, but they all had a message.
And the new learning through animation films became more popular as time went on, so audiences began to see more of those. Disney was the most relied upon studio in the war. Although after World War II, Disney transformed back into an entertainment studio, the kind of material that they put out still affects us in the type of media we see today. Throughout World War II, Disney made many sacrifices to aid his country during this massive conflict. He compromised his company's workflow, his finances, his studio, and his own artistic notion to provide solely for the war.
Although Disney would discontinue work for the war in the future, his tremendous contribution to the war will not soon be forgotten.